Welcome. Tonight, we begin an exploration into a particular period of American history, focusing on the various aspects of daily existence in the Old West. Our account will detail the adherence to certain routines and the interesting patterns that defined life in these developing territories. Now, try to relax your body and mind to make the most of this story. Dim the lights in your room and get comfortable. In the Old West, individuals known for their proficiency with firearms, often referred to as gunfighters or pistoleros, operated within a specific set of circumstances that dictated the common occurrences of their confrontations. These were not always spontaneous events. Rather, they often followed consistent patterns in their initiation and execution. The engagement of firearms in public settings frequently involved a series of predictable steps. Disputes might escalate over card games in a saloon, over perceived insults, or over property lines. The initial verbal exchange would often transition to a consistent tension, where individuals might methodically adjust their stance or position themselves for a potential draw. The typical distance between individuals in such confrontations was often short, usually within the confines of a street or a saloon's interior. The type of firearm most commonly associated with these individuals was the single-action revolver. These weapons required a specific repetitive action. The hammer had to be manually cocked for each shot. This meant that rapid firing involved a consistent sequence of cocking and pulling the trigger. The process of drawing such a weapon from a holster, bringing it to bear, and performing the necessary cocking action was a practiced routine for those who relied on them. The distinct click of a hammer being cocked was a consistent prelude to a shot. The significant aspect of firearm proficiency involved the speed of the draw. Individuals practiced tirelessly to reduce the time between perceiving a threat and firing a shot. This practice was a repetitive sequence of movements, the hand reaching for the pistol grip, the thumb cocking the hammer as the weapon cleared the holster, and the finger pressing the trigger. The objective was consistent efficiency in this rapid sequence. The relative speeds of different individuals in this action were often debated, but the underlying mechanics remained consistent. The accuracy of shots in these confrontations was also a subject of consistent discussion. While legend often depicts infallible marksmanship, the reality of quick draws, often under duress and with rudimentary sights, meant that hits were not always guaranteed. Shots might consistently strike a target's clothing, limbs, or miss entirely. The predictable trajectory of a lead bullet once fired was a constant in these exchanges. The sound of a bullet striking wood or dirt was a consistent outcome of a missed shot. The outcome of these confrontations often led to predictable results: injury, fatality, or less frequently, a resolution without firing. The aftermath involved the consistent process of retrieving weapons, attending to the wounded, and in some cases, the methodical involvement of law enforcement officials to investigate the circumstances. The predictable legal or social consequences followed a consistent pattern based on local ordinances and community acceptance. The consistent presence of these confrontations, though varied in outcome, was a defining element of certain frontier towns.
The personal lives and relationships within Old West frontier towns were structured by specific social norms and the practical realities of a developing environment. The term sexual life in this context refers to the consistent patterns of human relationships, marriage, family formation, and the presence of establishments that catered to specific social needs. Marriage and family formation followed traditional patterns, often influenced by the consistent movement of populations. Settlers moving westward often established families in new territories, with marriages conducted by traveling preachers or local authorities. The process of establishing a household involved a consistent effort to build shelter, cultivate land, and provide for dependents in often challenging conditions. The rhythmic daily tasks of maintaining a home and raising children were a central, unchanging aspect of family life. Frontier towns, being centers of commerce and transient populations, consistently included establishments that catered to various social interactions. Saloons, for instance, served as central gathering places. While offering alcoholic beverages, they also functioned as consistent venues for card games, conversations, and the exchange of information. The consistent clinking of glasses, the shuffle of cards, and the murmur of voices provided a constant auditory backdrop to these social hubs. Dance halls and theaters offered organized forms of entertainment. Dance halls consistently featured female performers who would dance with patrons for a fee, providing a structured form of social interaction. The music, often provided by a consistent pianist or small band, would set the rhythm for these engagements. The systematic nature of these interactions, where specific services were exchanged for payment, was a recognized part of the town's economic and social fabric. Brothels, also known as bordellos or sporting houses, were a consistent feature of many frontier towns, particularly those with a large transient male population, such as mining camps or cattle towns. These establishments operated under specific, albeit informal, social codes and business practices. They provided lodging and services by women who worked as prostitutes. The presence of these establishments was often regulated or at least acknowledged by local authorities, reflecting a consistent, if sometimes controversial, aspect of the social landscape. The women who worked in these establishments, often referred to as sporting women or fallen women, had a defined, consistent role within the social hierarchy of the frontier. While often marginalized from respectable society, their presence was a consistent economic reality in towns where male laborers significantly outnumbered women. Their daily routines involved a specific rhythm of interaction with clients and management within the confines of the establishment. The economic transactions were direct and consistently understood. The social dynamics of frontier towns, therefore, involved a consistent interplay between traditional family structures and the presence of establishments that catered to the needs of a transient, often male-dominated population. These arrangements reflected the practical realities of the time, where social norms adapted to the consistent influx of new arrivals and the specific economic drivers of the developing West.
The organization of personal lives, whether within established families or in the structured environment of saloons and brothels, followed consistent patterns of interaction and behavior. In the Old West, the role of the sheriff or marshal was a central component of maintaining order in often rapidly growing and sometimes unruly frontier towns. These individuals, often referred to as tough or hard-nosed, consistently performed a range of duties that were fundamental to the establishment of consistent legal frameworks. The primary duty of a sheriff was to enforce local laws and ordinances. This involved a consistent routine of patrolling the town, investigating disturbances, and apprehending individuals who violated community rules. The sheriff's presence, whether on horseback or walking the dusty streets, was a constant visual reminder of authority. The sounds of their boots on the boardwalk or the jingle of spurs were consistent auditory cues of their presence. Apprehending individuals involved a methodical process. A sheriff would consistently respond to reports of crime, gather information from witnesses, and then methodically track down suspects. The act of confronting an armed individual required a consistent display of authority and a precise understanding of their own firearm handling, often involving a calm, direct approach to de-escalate or resolve a situation. The consistent reading of local warrants and the methodical process of making an arrest were central to their duties. Beyond law enforcement, sheriffs often served as town administrators in a consistent capacity. They might be responsible for collecting taxes, overseeing elections, or managing the town jail. The daily routines of managing official documents, maintaining records, and ensuring the upkeep of public property were consistent bureaucratic tasks that underpinned the town's functioning. The sound of a pen scratching on paper in the sheriff's office was a common backdrop to their administrative work. Sheriffs also consistently played a role in resolving disputes between citizens. This could involve mediating arguments over land claims, water rights, or business transactions. Their consistent ability to apply local laws and common sense to these conflicts helped maintain a semblance of order and prevent escalating violence. The methodical process of listening to both sides of an argument and rendering a judgment was a regular part of their day. The toughness attributed to these sheriffs often stemmed from their consistent willingness to confront dangerous individuals and enforce laws in environments where official authority was still developing. This did not always involve dramatic gunfights, but rather a consistent presence, a reputation for unwavering resolve, and a methodical approach to their duties. Their consistent adherence to the law, even in challenging circumstances, contributed to the establishment of consistent legal systems in the frontier. The long-term impact of these sheriffs' consistent efforts was the gradual establishment of more stable and orderly communities. By consistently upholding the law and providing a predictable source of authority, they contributed to the transformation of chaotic frontier outposts into settled towns where commerce and civic life could flourish with greater consistency. Their enduring legacy is one of consistent civic service in a period of transition.
In the narratives of the Old West, certain individuals gained notoriety as outlaws, whose actions consistently disrupted the developing order of frontier communities. Their misdeeds often followed recognizable patterns, impacting trade, travel, and local security. One common systematic misdeed involved bank robberies. These acts typically targeted the central financial institutions of a town, where cash and valuables were consistently stored. The planning of a bank robbery involved consistent steps: surveillance of the bank's layout, observation of guard routines, and the selection of a specific time, often during business hours, to maximize the potential for obtaining funds. The execution of the robbery itself usually followed a pattern of forced entry, systematic demand for money, and a quick escape. The sound of gunshots, the shouts of perpetrators, and the commotion within the bank were consistent indicators of such an event. Stagecoach robberies were another prevalent form of outlaw activity, consistently targeting a vital mode of transport for mail, passengers, and valuables. These robberies often occurred in isolated stretches of road where the stagecoach would be systematically ambushed. The outlaws would consistently position themselves to halt the coach, demanding valuables from the strongbox, mail pouch, and passengers. The consistent rattling of the stagecoach, the thud of horses' hooves, and the sudden halt were predictable signals of an unfolding robbery. The escape route was often meticulously planned to evade immediate pursuit, utilizing knowledge of the terrain. Outlaws also consistently engaged in cattle rustling, the systematic theft of livestock. This required knowledge of ranching operations, cattle trails, and branding techniques. Rustlers would often operate under the cover of darkness, methodically rounding up cattle from large herds and driving them to remote locations for rebranding or sale. The consistent lowing of cattle and the subtle sounds of horses moving quietly were signs of this illicit activity. The economic impact of rustling on ranchers was often significant, leading to organized posses and vigilantism in response. The presence of these outlaws consistently necessitated the development of organized responses from law enforcement and communities. Sheriffs and marshals would methodically track down perpetrators, often following consistent trails or gathering information from informants. The pursuit of outlaws often involved long, arduous journeys across vast landscapes, requiring consistent determination and tracking skills. The long-term impact of these outlaws was not chaos, but rather a consistent push towards the strengthening of legal systems and community organization. Their systematic misdeeds spurred the development of more effective law enforcement agencies, the consistent establishment of legal precedents, and the organization of local militias or vigilantes committees to maintain order. The very actions of these outlaws, through their consistent disruption, inadvertently contributed to the formalization of justice in the developing West. The Old West, as a period of rapid change and expansion, consistently generated its own body of myths and legends. These narratives, though not always factual,
became a consistent part of the cultural fabric, offering explanations for unusual events or providing symbolic representations of the challenges and figures of the frontier.
Tales of hidden treasures, often involving lost gold mines or buried bandit loot, were consistently prevalent. These stories would often include specific, detailed clues about geographical markers or secret maps, enticing individuals to embark on systematic searches across vast, challenging terrains. The consistent allure of quick riches fueled many solitary expeditions, despite the low probability of success. The methodical reading of old maps and the persistent digging in remote locations were consistent actions tied to these legends. Legends surrounding particularly infamous or enigmatic figures, both lawmen and outlaws, were consistently circulated. The exploits of individuals known for their speed with a gun, their cunning escapes, or their unwavering pursuit of justice became embellished with consistent details that elevated them beyond ordinary human capability. These narratives were passed down through oral tradition and later through dime novels, systematically shaping public perception. The consistent recounting of these tales in saloons and around campfires contributed to their enduring popularity. The ghost towns of the Old West also contributed consistently to its mythology. Abandoned mining camps or settlements left desolate after the exhaustion of resources or economic downturns became settings for tales of lingering spirits or unexplained phenomena. The consistent emptiness of these towns, with their silent buildings and creaking doors, allowed the imagination to systematically fill the void with stories of their former inhabitants or their tragic ends. The sounds of the wind whistling through empty structures often lent an eerie atmosphere to these consistent narratives. Stories of supernatural creatures or unusual encounters, while less common than human-centric legends, also formed a consistent part of frontier folklore. Tales of elusive Bigfoot-like creatures in remote mountains or mysterious lights in the desert sky sometimes emerged from isolated experiences or the misinterpretation of natural phenomena. The consistent recounting of these strange occurrences provided a means to explain the inexplicable in a vast and untamed landscape. The consistent appeal of these myths and legends lay in their ability to provide a framework for understanding a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. They offered systematic explanations for fortune, misfortune, and the inherent dangers of the frontier, transforming the unknown into a narrative that could be consistently shared and comprehended. Their consistent presence in oral and written forms helped solidify a collective identity for the Old West. The duel, often romanticized in popular culture, was in reality a highly ritualized and often brief event in the Old West, consistently driven by specific codes of conduct and social expectations.
While not an everyday occurrence, its mechanics followed predictable patterns. A duel typically originated from a perceived insult or a serious disagreement that could not be consistently resolved through negotiation. The challenge to a duel usually followed a specific, formal process, often involving a direct verbal challenge or, in some cases, the involvement of seconds to arrange the terms. This consistent escalation from argument to challenge followed unwritten rules of social engagement.
The choice of weapons was consistently important, with pistols being the most common. The specific type of pistol, its caliber, and its condition would be consistently noted by participants. The loading of the firearm, often a single-action revolver, involved a methodical process of inserting cartridges into the cylinder and cocking the hammer, a consistent preparation for the confrontation. The location of the duel was consistently chosen to be a relatively open space, such as a dusty street at dawn or a clearing outside of town. This provided a consistent, unobstructed area for the participants. The distance between the duelists was often predetermined, usually around 10 to 20 paces, ensuring a consistent range for engagement. The drawing of a line in the dirt indicating the starting position was a consistent visual marker. The signal to draw was a crucial, highly specific moment. This could be a verbal command, draw, or the dropping of a handkerchief, or the tolling of a church bell. The consistent nature of this signal was vital to ensure fairness and prevent premature action. The participants would consistently stand facing each other, waiting for this specific auditory or visual cue. The draw itself was a rapid yet mechanically consistent sequence of movements. The hand would move to the pistol grip, drawing the weapon from its holster. The thumb would consistently cock the hammer as the pistol cleared the leather, bringing it to the firing position. The finger would then consistently apply pressure to the trigger. The entire action was a practiced routine, aiming for maximum speed and efficiency. The sound of the pistol clearing the holster, followed by the distinct click of the hammer, then the gunshot, comprised a consistent auditory sequence. The outcome of a duel was often quickly determined. Shots might miss, wound, or kill. The consistent impact of a lead bullet striking wood, dirt, or a target was the predictable result. After the shots were fired, the confrontation would consistently cease, and attention would turn to the injured or the methodical investigation by law enforcement. The predictable legal or social consequences would then follow, depending on local ordinances and witness accounts. While dramatic in their portrayal, duels were systematic events, governed by consistent rules and predictable mechanics. They served as a brutal yet formalized method of resolving disputes in a society where formal legal structures were still developing, demonstrating a consistent reliance on personal codes of honor and a methodical application of force. The daily routine of cowboys in the Old West was characterized by consistent, repetitive tasks, essential for the methodical management of large cattle herds.
Their lives were structured by the needs of the livestock and the vast, open landscapes. A typical day for a cowboy began before sunrise, a consistent early start regardless of the season. The first task often involved preparing coffee and a simple breakfast over an open fire, a repetitive act performed in silence as the dawn broke. The methodical grinding of coffee beans and the quiet sizzle of bacon or beans in a cast-iron skillet were common sounds of the morning camp. This consistent fuel was necessary for the day's physical demands.
Following breakfast, the primary duty involved herding and managing cattle. This meant long hours on horseback, systematically moving the herd across pastures, guiding them to watering holes, or preventing them from straying. The consistent sound of hooves on dry earth, the lowing of cattle, and the subtle commands exchanged between cowboys were constant auditory elements of this work. The repetitive movements of riding, turning, and guiding the horse were central to their daily efforts. Cattle branding was a crucial, seasonal, and highly systematic task. During specific periods, calves would be consistently rounded up, separated from their mothers, and branded with the ranch's unique mark. This involved heating an iron brand in a fire until it was consistently glowing hot, then methodically pressing it onto the calf's hide. The smell of burning hair and the consistent lowing of the calves were defining sensory experiences of branding days. This repetitive process ensured clear ownership and prevented rustling. Roundups, large-scale operations to gather cattle, were complex and consistently organized events. Cowboys from various ranches would systematically converge, working together to consolidate herds that had spread out over vast ranges. This involved methodical coordination between riders, consistent communication across distances, and long hours in the saddle. The very scale of the operation demanded a systematic approach to movement and control of the animals. The maintenance of equipment was a consistent daily ritual. Saddles needed to be cleaned and oiled, bridles inspected, and ropes checked for wear. This methodical attention to tools ensured their consistent functionality during demanding work. The quiet creak of leather being worked and the subtle scent of saddle soap were consistent components of their evenings. Firearms also required consistent cleaning and maintenance, a quiet, methodical process to ensure their reliable operation. Evenings in camp often involved simple, consistent routines. After a meal, cowboys might gather around a campfire, consistently sharing stories, playing cards, or quietly attending to personal tasks. The crackle of the fire and the subtle sounds of the night provided a consistent backdrop to these periods of rest. Sleep was often under the open sky, a consistent experience dictated by the sounds of the herd and the vastness of the wilderness. The life of a cowboy was fundamentally about consistent application of skill, endurance, and methodical routine, adapting to the unchanging demands of livestock and the natural environment. Their daily existence was a series of predictable tasks performed with an unwavering rhythm. The construction and architecture of frontier towns in the Old West followed consistent functional patterns, reflecting the rapid growth and practical needs of newly established communities. These towns often emerged quickly, with building practices dictated by available materials and immediate requirements. The most common building material was consistently wood, particularly in areas with access to timber. Buildings were often constructed from rough-hewn lumber, assembled with basic tools and techniques.
The consistent sound of hammers striking nails, saws cutting wood, and the creak of boards being moved filled the air during the construction phase of a new settlement. The repetitive stacking of lumber and the systematic framing of structures defined the early town building process. The layout of frontier towns consistently followed a grid pattern, with streets running perpendicular to each other. This simple, methodical design allowed for easy subdivision of land into consistent plots and facilitated the systematic expansion of the town. Buildings were often constructed in rows along these main streets, facing inward to create a defined commercial and social corridor. The consistent sight of straight streets and rectangular plots was a hallmark of these burgeoning settlements. False fronts were a consistent architectural feature of many commercial buildings, particularly saloons, general stores, and hotels. These were tall rectangular facades built above the actual roofline of a smaller building, designed to make the structure appear larger and more imposing from the street. The consistent application of these false fronts created a visual uniformity along the main thoroughfares, aiming to convey an impression of prosperity and permanence. The simple geometric shape of these facades presented a predictable visual element. Saloons, as central social establishments, consistently occupied prominent positions on the main streets. Their architecture was often functional, with a long bar, tables for cards, and sometimes a small stage. The layout was consistently designed for ease of movement and service. The sound of clinking glasses and distant piano music were consistent auditory cues from these establishments. General stores were equally central, serving as consistent hubs for commerce. Their interior layout was typically organized, with shelves packed from floor to ceiling with a predictable array of goods: dry goods, hardware, tools, and provisions. The consistent display of merchandise and the systematic process of weighing bulk items were daily routines. Residential buildings varied in style, but often followed consistent, simple designs. Early dwellings might be sod houses in treeless plains areas where layers of prairie turf were systematically stacked to form walls. In timber-rich regions, simple log cabins or frame houses built with consistently available lumber were common. The methodical construction of these homes, layer by layer or board by board, provided consistent shelter. The town jail or sheriff's office was also a consistent feature, often a sturdy, singular building designed for security. Its architecture was typically plain and robust, reflecting its unglamorous function. The consistent clang of the jail cell door and the quiet presence of the sheriff's desk were characteristic elements of these buildings. The consistent architectural patterns of Old West towns reflected their immediate practical needs and the resources available. Buildings were constructed with a methodical efficiency, creating functional spaces that supported the consistent daily routines of frontier life. The uniform appearance of main streets, despite individual variations, conveyed a sense of growing order and established settlement.
The technology and operation of Western railroads introduced a new, consistent rhythm of progress and movement to the Old West, fundamentally altering landscapes and daily lives. The railway was a complex system, built and operated with methodical precision. The construction of railroad lines involved immense, consistent effort. Surveyors meticulously mapped out routes, often across vast, untamed territories. Crews then systematically cleared the land, leveled the terrain, and laid down ties, wooden sleepers, at consistent intervals. On top of these, heavy steel rails were consistently hoisted and spiked into place. The rhythmic clang of hammers striking spikes, the shouts of workers coordinating efforts, and the steady movement of construction teams were constant sounds of railroad building. This repetitive manual labor extended across thousands of miles. The locomotives themselves were technological marvels of the era, primarily steam-powered engines. Their operation involved a consistent series of mechanical processes. Water in a boiler was heated by burning coal or wood, consistently producing steam under high pressure. This steam was then methodically directed into cylinders, pushing pistons that in turn drove the large wheels of the locomotive. The rhythmic puffing of the steam, the steady rotation of the driving wheels, and the distinct sound of the whistle were characteristic auditory elements of a train in motion. The consistent stoking of the firebox by the firemen maintained the engine's power. Operating a train involved a consistent, disciplined routine for the engineer and conductor. The engineer consistently monitored boiler pressure, speed, and track signals. The conductor was responsible for the train's manifest, passenger tickets, and ensuring consistent adherence to the timetable. The communication between the crew, often through a system of whistles or hand signals, followed consistent protocols. The predictable arrival and departure times at stations were central to the railroad's operation. Railway stations became consistent hubs of activity in towns along the lines. Their architecture was often functional, designed to facilitate the systematic loading and unloading of passengers and freight. The consistent sound of the train pulling into the station, the hiss of steam, the shouts of porters, and the movement of passengers and luggage defined these bustling points of connection. The telegraph lines that consistently ran alongside the railroad tracks were an integral part of their operation.
They allowed for rapid and consistent communication between stations, enabling the methodical scheduling of trains, the relaying of messages about track conditions, and the consistent coordination of freight movements. The rhythmic clicking of telegraph keys transmitting Morse code provided a constant, precise communication backbone for the entire system. The consistent impact of Western railroads was immense. They provided a reliable and often faster means of transporting goods to markets, particularly agricultural products and minerals, profoundly influencing the economic development of the frontier.
They also facilitated the consistent movement of settlers westward, opening up new territories for development. The unwavering consistency of the railway schedule and the sheer scale of its operations brought a new level of order and predictability to the sprawling landscapes of the Old West. The pursuit of precious metals in the Old West, particularly gold and silver mines, often defined the existence of many frontier settlements. The daily routines within these mines were characterized by consistent, repetitive, and physically demanding tasks performed with methodical precision. The process of extracting ore involved several systematic steps. Miners would consistently begin by drilling holes into rock faces. This was a repetitive physical action, often using hand drills and hammers, or later, pneumatic drills that produced a consistent rhythmic sound. The holes were drilled to a specific depth and pattern, ensuring optimal placement for the next stage. The sound of drills biting into rock was a constant element in mining camps. Following drilling, blasting was a consistent method to break up hard rock. Dynamite or other explosives would be carefully placed into the drilled holes and then detonated in a controlled sequence. The distant boom of an explosion, followed by the rumble of falling rock, was a consistent sound that signaled progress in the mine. After the blast, miners would methodically return to the tunnels to remove the loosened rock. The removal of ore from the mine shafts was a consistent and arduous task. Miners would systematically shovel rock into ore carts, which were then pushed or pulled along narrow tracks to the surface. The consistent creak of the carts and the scrape of shovels against rock defined the sounds of extraction. In deeper mines, rudimentary hoisting systems, often powered by hand cranks or steam engines, would consistently lift the ore carts to the surface. The steady clang of chains and the rhythmic chugging of engines were continuous auditory cues. Once on the surface, the ore underwent a consistent processing to separate the valuable metals. For gold, panning was a basic and repetitive method involving systematically swirling water and gravel in a metal pan to separate heavier gold flakes. The consistent sloshing sound of water in a pan was a common sound of individual prospecting. Larger operations used sluice boxes, long wooden troughs with baffles that consistently trapped gold as water flowed through. The continuous rush of water over rocks and the gentle filtering of sediment defined this methodical process. For silver and other ores, more complex milling processes were consistently employed. Ore would be systematically crushed into fine powder, using large stamp mills, producing a consistent, thundering rhythmic sound.
The pulverized ore would then be mixed with water and chemicals, like mercury for amalgamation, though with severe health consequences, to systematically extract the metal.
The consistent churning of machinery and the methodical handling of materials defined these processing operations. The working conditions in mines were consistently challenging. Miners worked long, predictable shifts in dark, damp, and often cramped tunnels. The consistent drip of water, the low murmur of distant conversations, and the constant threat of cave-ins or gas pockets were defining elements of their environment. The methodical installation of timber supports to prevent collapse was a continuous and vital task. The consistent pursuit of gold and silver shaped the economic structure of many towns, drawing in diverse populations and establishing consistent supply chains for equipment and provisions. The rhythmic, demanding work of the mines, with its predictable cycles of drilling, blasting, and processing, was a central, unchanging feature of life for thousands of individuals. Travel across the vast distances of the Old West consistently relied on wagons and stagecoaches, modes of transport that followed specific routines and faced consistent challenges dictated by the terrain and environmental conditions. The preparation of a wagon or stagecoach for a journey was a consistent, methodical process. Drivers or teamsters would systematically inspect the wheels, axles, and harnesses, ensuring all components were in working order. Horses or mules would be consistently hitched to the vehicle in a specific order, their harness adjusted for optimal pulling power. The rhythmic clinking of harness buckles and the soft snorts of the animals were common sounds of departure. Once underway, the daily routine of travel followed a consistent pattern. Journeys would typically begin at dawn, following established trails or rudimentary roads. The consistent rattling of the wagon over uneven terrain, the rhythmic creak of the wooden frame, and the steady thud of hooves on the dirt path defined the sounds of overland travel. Drivers maintained a consistent pace, allowing for predictable travel times between stops. Rest stops were a consistent feature of any long journey. These might occur at established way stations, military forts, or simply at suitable spots for watering animals and preparing meals. The methodical process of unhitching the animals, setting up a temporary camp, and preparing simple, repetitive meals over an open fire was a consistent part of the day. The quiet sounds of animals grazing and the crackle of a campfire provided predictable interludes in the journey. Stagecoaches, designed for carrying passengers and mail, operated on consistent schedules between towns. Passengers would typically purchase tickets, load their luggage, and take their assigned seats. The stagecoach driver maintained a consistent pace, aiming to arrive at each station within a specific time frame. The experience inside the coach involved consistent swaying and jolting, with passengers enduring long hours in close quarters. The sounds of conversation, card games, or the rustle of newspapers were common inside the vehicle.
The changing of horses at relay stations was a rapid, yet consistently efficient operation. Fresh teams of horses would be kept ready, and the exhausted team would be systematically unhitched and replaced within a matter of minutes. This consistent exchange of horsepower allowed the stagecoach to maintain its speed and adhere to its schedule. The consistent shouts of the stable hands and the quick movements of the horses defined these brief but intense stops. Navigating the terrain presented consistent challenges. Wagons and stagecoaches
often had to cross rivers, traverse mountain passes, or endure long stretches of dry plains. The methodical selection of the best path, the consistent application of brakes on descents, and the careful guidance of the team were crucial skills. Unpaved roads could consistently become muddy during rain or dusty in dry seasons, affecting travel speed and comfort. The consistent, repetitive nature of wagon and stagecoach travel profoundly shaped the experience of moving across the American West. It was a journey defined by predictable routines, consistent reliance on animals, and methodical adaptation to the unchanging demands of the landscape, contributing to the gradual development of consistent travel patterns across the frontier. Commerce and typical goods in the Old West followed consistent patterns of supply and demand, influenced by the needs of a growing population and the challenges of transport. The establishment of general stores and trading posts provided systematic access to essential items. The general store was a consistent hub of economic activity in any frontier town. These establishments stocked a predictable array of goods, ranging from tools and hardware to dry goods, clothing, and basic food provisions. The consistent display of merchandise on shelves, often floor to ceiling, provided a visual tapestry of available products. The specific layout of the store, designed for systematic customer movement, was a common feature. The types of goods available were consistently practical and essential for frontier life. Farmers and ranchers relied on consistent supplies of seeds, agricultural implements, and fencing wire. Miners needed picks, shovels, blasting powder, and gold pans, all consistently stocked. Householders sought basic foodstuffs like flour, sugar, salt, and coffee, alongside fabrics and simple kitchenware. The consistent demand for these basic necessities drove trade. The process of transaction was consistent. Customers would approach a counter, and the storekeeper would methodically weigh bulk items, measure lengths of fabric, or count out nails. Payment was typically made in coins, often gold or silver, or sometimes through bartering for locally produced goods. The consistent exchange of currency or goods for desired items defined the daily rhythm of commerce. The sound of coins clinking on the counter was a consistent auditory element. Traveling merchants or peddlers consistently brought goods to more isolated settlements or ranches that were too far from a general store. These individuals would transport a portable but consistent selection of goods on horseback or by wagon.
Their arrival in a remote area, announcing their presence, was a predictable event, bringing with it an opportunity for isolated residents to acquire needed supplies. Specialized tradesmen also operated with consistent routines. A blacksmith, for instance, consistently worked with iron, shaping tools, horseshoeing, and repairing metal items. The consistent clang of the hammer on the anvil and the hiss of hot metal in water were characteristic sounds of a blacksmith's shop. A cobbler consistently mended boots and shoes, a repetitive and necessary service. The supply chain for these goods, though less sophisticated than modern systems, followed consistent patterns. Goods would be transported from eastern manufacturing centers via steamboat, railroad, or large wagon trains to central distribution points in the West, and then systematically moved to individual towns. The consistent arrival of freight wagons or trains laden with supplies was a vital event for any frontier community. The consistent flow of commerce and the availability of predictable goods were fundamental to the establishment and growth of communities in the Old West. They provided the essential materials for survival and development, establishing a systematic economic framework for the vast and expanding territories. The daily lives of individuals in the Old West consistently revolved around a set of practical tools and everyday equipment, essential for survival, work, and the maintenance of their developing communities. The use of these items followed predictable routines, reflecting their consistent utility. Axes and saws were fundamental for shaping wood, a consistent material for construction and fuel. The rhythmic swing of an axe felling trees, or the steady back and forth motion of a saw cutting lumber, were common sounds in frontier settlements. These tools were consistently used for building cabins, fences, and various wooden structures. Their consistent sharpening and maintenance were routine tasks, ensuring their functionality. For cooking and domestic tasks, cast iron cookware was consistently prevalent. Heavy skillets, Dutch ovens, and kettles were used over open fires or on wood-burning stoves. The consistent sizzle of cooking food, the gentle clatter of utensils against iron, and the methodical cleaning of these durable pots and pans were daily occurrences. The weight and robust nature of cast iron ensured its consistent performance in rugged environments. Firearms, beyond their role in defense or conflict, were also consistent tools for hunting and pest control. Rifles and shotguns were regularly cleaned and maintained, a methodical process to ensure their reliability. The consistent loading of cartridges and the sound of dry firing during practice were familiar sounds. Traps for small game, consistently set and checked, also contributed to sustenance. Leather goods were central to cowboy life and general transport. Saddles, bridles, belts, and boots were consistently made from durable leather. The methodical cleaning, oiling, and repair of these items were regular maintenance tasks. The consistent squeak of new leather or the soft creak of well-worn gear were common sounds of the working West.
Farm implements, though basic, were consistently used for cultivation. Plows, hoes, and shovels were manually operated, requiring consistent physical effort to prepare soil and tend to crops. The methodical rhythm of digging, planting, and harvesting defined the agricultural cycles. The consistent maintenance of these tools, involving sharpening and minor repairs, was essential for consistent agricultural output. Lighting in homes and businesses consistently relied on simple technologies. Kerosene lamps, with their consistent glow, required daily filling and wick trimming. Candles, though less bright, provided a consistent flickering light. The methodical process of preparing and lighting these sources of illumination marked the onset of evening activities. For water access, wells and pumps were consistent necessities. The methodical drawing of water from a well, often involving the consistent creak of a hand-operated pump, was a daily chore. In some areas, rainwater collection systems provided a consistent, if sometimes intermittent, supply. The consistent presence and methodical use of these everyday tools and equipment highlight the practical, repetitive nature of life in the Old West. Individuals relied on a consistent set of skills and reliable implements to manage their daily routines and build their communities. The vast distances and dispersed populations of the Old West consistently presented challenges for communication, leading to the development and reliance on specific methodical systems for transmitting information. The mail service, delivered by stagecoach or horseback riders, Pony Express, was a consistent lifeline for communication. Letters and newspapers were transported across vast distances, following established routes and schedules. The consistent arrival of a stagecoach or a lone rider at a post office was a significant event, bringing news from distant settlements or loved ones. The methodical sorting of mail and the consistent exchange of letters between sender and receiver defined this primary mode of written communication. The consistent sound of hooves on a dirt road, fading into the distance, symbolized the slow but steady journey of messages. The telegraph introduced a revolutionary and consistently faster method of communication. Telegraph lines, consisting of wires strung across poles, consistently followed railroad lines or established routes. Telegraph operators would methodically translate messages into Morse code, a system of dots and dashes, by consistently pressing a key, and then transmit these signals across the wires. The rhythmic clicking of the telegraph key, transmitting and receiving messages, was a defining sound of modern communication in the West.
Messages sent by telegraph, while faster, still followed a consistent procedure. A person would present a message to the operator, who would systematically count the words and calculate the cost. The message would then be transmitted, received by an operator at the destination, and transcribed. The consistent process of sending, receiving, and delivering telegrams ensured a reliable, if somewhat formal, method of rapid communication over long distances. The crisp sound of a telegram arriving was a consistent signal of urgent news. Newspapers also played a consistent role in disseminating information within and between communities. Printed on rudimentary presses, often with inconsistent quality,
These papers would publish local news, advertisements, and syndicated stories from other regions. The consistent delivery of newspapers by stagecoach or train allowed for the regular spread of information, shaping public opinion and keeping distant communities informed about events. The consistent rustle of newspaper pages being read in a saloon or home was a common sound. Oral communication remained consistently important, especially in close-knit communities. Information was consistently exchanged through conversations in saloons, general stores, and at community gatherings. Traveling preachers, merchants, and cowboys consistently carried news and gossip from one settlement to another, acting as informal conduits of information. The consistent sharing of stories and experiences around campfires or over meals formed a vital, unstructured communication network. Wanted posters served as a consistent visual form of communication regarding law enforcement. These posters, displaying descriptions and images of individuals sought by authorities, were consistently posted in prominent locations in towns. Their consistent appearance was a visual reminder of ongoing efforts to maintain order. The consistent development of communication methods in the Old West, from horseback riders to the telegraph, steadily reduced the isolation of frontier communities. It allowed for the consistent flow of information, shaping social interactions, economic activities, and the very structure of daily life. The consistent search for connection across vast distances defined this era of communication. The flora and fauna of the Old West consistently defined its vast landscapes, shaping the daily experiences and livelihoods of its inhabitants. The interactions with these natural elements followed predictable patterns dictated by seasons and ecological roles. The prairie grasses were a consistent and defining feature of vast stretches of the West, particularly in the Great Plains. These grasses, often tall and swaying in the wind, provided consistent forage for immense herds of bison. The consistent rustle of the wind through the tall grass was a characteristic sound of the plains. The cyclical growth and dormancy of these grasses consistently influenced the movement of grazers. Bison, in turn, were a consistent and central component of the prairie ecosystem and the livelihood of many indigenous peoples and early settlers. Their massive herds moved in predictable patterns across the plains, influenced by seasonal changes in forage. The consistent lowing of the herd and the thunderous sound of their hooves during a stampede were defining auditory experiences. Their consistent presence provided a primary food source and materials for clothing and shelter. In more arid regions, cacti were a consistent and recognizable part of the landscape. Their various species, with their distinct shapes and spines, were adapted to survive with minimal water. Their consistent green or gray-green of their flesh provided a visual contrast against the dry earth. Other drought-resistant plants like sagebrush and mesquite consistently covered large areas, their subtle scent carried on the dry winds.
Coyotes were consistent inhabitants of almost all Western landscapes. Their distinctive howling, particularly at dusk and dawn, was a familiar and consistent sound across the plains and deserts. Their consistent scavenging habits meant they were often seen near human settlements or cattle herds. Rattlesnakes, with their consistent warning rattle, were a predictable danger in many dry areas. Their distinctive sound, when agitated, was a clear and consistent signal to maintain distance. Their consistent presence required careful attention to foot placement and campsite selection. Birds of prey, such as hawks and eagles, consistently soared overhead, their keen eyesight scanning the ground for prey. Their silent, consistent circling in the vast skies was a common visual element. Smaller birds, like larks and sparrows, provided consistent background songs in various habitats. The rivers and streams were consistent lifelines, supporting distinct riparian flora and fauna. Cottonwood trees consistently lined riverbanks, providing shade and shelter. Fish consistently inhabited the waters, attracting consistent fishing activity by humans and animals. The consistent sound of flowing water was a defining feature of these vital corridors. The consistent interaction with this diverse flora and fauna shaped the daily lives of Old West inhabitants. Their understanding of animal behavior, plant uses, and the consistent patterns of the natural environment was crucial for survival and resource management. The unchanging cycles of life defined the rhythms of life across the vast Western landscapes. Saloons in the Old West consistently served as central hubs for various forms of entertainment and social interaction. Beyond merely serving alcoholic beverages, these establishments provided a consistent venue for diversions that structured the leisure time of frontier inhabitants. Card games were a prevalent and consistent form of entertainment in saloons. Games like poker, faro, and blackjack were played with consistent rules, offering opportunities for both recreation and gambling. The rhythmic shuffle of cards, the consistent click of chips, and the low murmur of conversation or occasional outbursts were constant auditory elements in these establishments. The act of placing bets and drawing cards followed a methodical, predictable sequence. Billiards and pool tables were also consistent features in many saloons, providing a quieter yet still engaging form of diversion. The soft click of billiard balls, the steady concentration of players, and the occasional soft thud of a cue stick against the felt were common sounds. The game followed consistent rules, offering a predictable challenge. Live music often provided a consistent auditory backdrop in saloons. A solo pianist, often playing on an upright piano, would perform a repertoire of popular tunes. The consistent melodies, whether lively or melancholic, contributed to the atmosphere of the establishment. In some larger saloons, A small band might perform, creating a more robust sound. The rhythmic quality of the music was a constant element of the entertainment. Live houses, often adjacent to or integrated within saloons, offered structured social entertainment. These venues consistently featured female performers who would dance with patrons for a fee, providing a consistent form of social interaction for men. The music for dancing was regularly provided by a band or pianist, setting a predictable rhythm for the dance floor. The systematic nature of these interactions, where specific services were exchanged for payment, was a consistent part of the town's economic and social fabric. Other forms of casual entertainment included storytelling and conversation. Saloons served as consistent gathering places where individuals could exchange news, recount experiences, and engage in debates. The murmur of voices, punctuated by laughter or exclamations, was a constant sound. This informal exchange of information contributed to a collective understanding of events and people in the West. The serving of alcoholic beverages followed consistent patterns, with bartenders methodically pouring drinks and mixing simple concoctions. The consistent clinking of bottles and glasses and the swish of liquid were familiar sounds. The consumption of alcohol contributed to the social atmosphere, often leading to predictable behaviors and interactions. Even the interior design of saloons followed consistent patterns. Long wooden bars, often polished, were a central feature, behind which bottles and glasses were consistently arranged. Tables and chairs were systematically placed for gaming and conversation. The lighting, often from kerosene lamps or gas lights, provided a consistent, warmed glow. These diverse forms of entertainment in saloons, though varied in their specifics, consistently provided a predictable outlet for leisure and social interaction in the often challenging environment of the Old West. They offered a structured escape from the routines of work and travel, reinforcing consistent patterns of community life. Our review concludes with a closer look at the consistent operations of wagons and stagecoaches, emphasizing the meticulous logistics and the role of draft animals that enabled methodical travel across the vast expanses of the Old West. The preparation of a wagon or stagecoach was a consistent, methodical process. Drivers, known as teamsters for wagons or drivers for stagecoaches, would systematically inspect the vehicle's components, the wheels, axles, brakes, and kingpin. Any necessary repairs, such as replacing a spoke or tightening a bolt, would be performed with consistent precision. This pre-trip inspection was a predictable routine, ensuring the vehicle's reliability on often rough terrain. The hitching of the draft animals was a precise and consistent operation. Teams of horses or mules, often numbering 2, 4, or 6 animals for wagons, and 4 to 6 for stagecoaches, would systematically be led into position. Harnesses, consisting of collars, hames, traces, and bridles, were consistently placed and secured. Each buckle, strap, and hook was methodically fastened, ensuring the animals were properly aligned to pull the load. The rhythmic jingle of harness chains and the soft snorts of the animals were common sounds during this preparatory phase. Once underway, the pace of travel was consistent and largely dictated by the animals. Wagons typically moved at a walking pace, roughly 2 to 3 miles per hour, allowing for a methodical progression across the landscape. Stagecoaches, designed for faster travel, would maintain a consistent trot or canter, covering perhaps 5 to 7 miles per hour on good roads. This consistent speed allowed for predictable arrival times at designated stops. The rhythmic thud of hooves on dirt, the steady creak of the wooden vehicle, and the consistent rattling of equipment were constant auditory elements of the journey. Rest stops and relay stations were consistent features of any long journey. For wagons, these might be simple overnight camps, where animals were unhitched, watered, and grazed, following a predictable routine. Stagecoaches operated with a more formalized system of relay stations every 10 to 15 miles. Here, exhausted teams of horses would be systematically unhitched and replaced with fresh, rested animals within a matter of minutes. This rapid, consistent exchange of power allowed the stagecoach to maintain its schedule with predictable efficiency. The shouts of stable hands and the quick movements of animals defined these brief, intense stops. Navigation involved consistent adherence to established trails or recognizable landmarks. Drivers relied on their knowledge of the terrain, often following natural contours or established wagon ruts. The consistent presence of specific mountain ranges, river crossings, or prominent rock formations served as reliable navigational aids. In the absence of clear pathways, reliance on a compass for maintaining a consistent direction was paramount. The cargo carried by wagons and stagecoaches followed consistent patterns based on demand. Wagons primarily transported bulk goods like provisions, lumber, mining equipment, and settlers' belongings. Stagecoaches carried lighter, higher-value items such as mail, express packages, and small amounts of specie. The methodical loading and securing of these diverse items ensured their consistent delivery to destinations. The consistent, repetitive nature of wagon and stagecoach travel profoundly shaped the experience of moving across the American West. It was a journey defined by predictable routines, consistent reliance on animal power, and methodical adaptation to the unchanging demands of the landscape. Contributing to the gradual development of consistent travel patterns across the frontier. The rhythms of the animals and the methodical actions of the drivers provided a constant, understated beat to life on the move. The social fabric of the Old West, particularly in rapidly growing frontier towns, consistently included a variety of roles and establishments that, while sometimes controversial by later standards, served specific functions within the economic and social dynamics of the era. Among these were women who held prominent, if often complex, positions within the public sphere, often operating within the consistent routines of specific businesses. Individuals known as actresses, dancers, or singers frequently held visible roles in saloons and dance halls. These establishments were central to the entertainment landscape, providing a consistent venue for various forms of diversion. The women employed in these capacities performed on stages, danced with patrons, or engaged in conversation, all within a structured exchange of services for payment. Their consistent presence and performance were integral to the daily operation of these establishments, which catered to a predominantly male population seeking leisure and social interaction after arduous work. The music, often provided by a pianist or a small ensemble, set a consistent rhythm for these social engagements. Their attire was often elaborate, designed for visibility in public settings, adhering to specific fashion trends of the time. Beyond entertainment, some women consistently operated within gambling houses, either as dealers, shills, individuals who encouraged play, or simply as hostesses. Their role was to maintain a consistent presence at the gaming tables, contributing to the establishment's atmosphere and ensuring the methodical flow of card games or other wagering activities. The rhythmic shuffle of cards, the consistent click of chips, and the murmur of voices at the tables defined the auditory environment of these venues. These roles required consistent social engagement and a familiarity with the rules and customs of various games. The segment of the female population, commonly referred to as sporting women or demi-mondes, consistently occupied a distinct social and economic niche in many frontier towns. These individuals often worked in brothels, also known as bordellos or sporting houses, which establishments provided specific services. These houses operated with defined, albeit often informal, business practices and consistent routines. They typically offered private rooms, and services were provided at a set fee, creating a consistent economic transaction. The interior of these establishments often featured parlors for social interaction, consistently furnished to create a comfortable, if temporary, environment for patrons. The daily lives of women working in these establishments involved a consistent rhythm dictated by the hours of operation and the flow of clientele. Their routines included maintaining their living spaces, preparing for the evening's activities, and engaging in repetitive social interactions with patrons. Their presence in these towns, particularly those with a large transient male population, like mining camps or cattle towns, was a consistent economic reality. Local authorities often had a pragmatic, if not always formal, acknowledgement of these businesses, and their operations were often integrated, if indirectly, into the town's tax structures through licenses or fines, creating a consistent, if informal, regulatory framework. Some individuals within this profession gained particular notoriety or recognition, becoming famous not necessarily for their actions, but for their consistent presence, their business acumen, or their distinctive personalities within their established roles. Their names might appear in local newspapers, sometimes in advertisements for their establishments, or their reputations might be consistently discussed by the male populations that frequented these venues. The very act of becoming famous within this context often meant a consistent and reliable presence in the public eye of their specific social sphere. This recognition was a consistent byproduct of operating a successful business in a specialized sector of the frontier economy. Life in the Old West often involved hygiene habits that, from a modern perspective, might appear curious or uncommon, yet were consistently practiced due to the prevailing conditions, available resources, and prevailing scientific understanding of the time. These routines were systematically adapted to the environment. Bathing was typically not a daily ritual for most individuals, particularly in rural or frontier settings. Access to readily available, clean, heated water was often limited. For cowboys on the trail or miners in remote camps, bathing might occur only periodically, perhaps once a week or even less frequently, often in cold streams or rivers. This consistent infrequency was a practical adaptation to resource scarcity. The methodical process of heating water over a campfire or using a small amount of collected rainwater for a partial wash was a notable event. Public bathhouses existed in larger towns and cities, providing a consistent venue for more thorough cleansing. These establishments offered tubs of heated water for a fee, allowing individuals to systematically wash themselves and their clothes. The consistent sounds of water splashing and scrubbing indicated the activity within these establishments. For many, a visit to a bathhouse was a deliberate and consistent act of personal upkeep, not a daily routine.
Dental hygiene was rudimentary. Toothbrushes were uncommon, and toothpastes, as known today, did not exist. Individuals might consistently use their fingers, a rough cloth, or chew on twigs to clean their teeth. The consistent lack of advanced dental care meant that tooth decay and loss were common occurrences, a predictable consequence of the limited practices. Remedies for toothaches often involved consistent application of herbs or whiskey. Hair washing was also infrequent. Individuals might consistently rinse their hair with water, but regular shampooing was not practiced. Hair was often kept covered by hats to protect it from dust and sun and to contain it. The consistent brushing of hair was a more common maintenance practice than washing. The simple act of combing or brushing hair to remove dust was a consistent daily routine. Laundry was a laborious and consistently infrequent task. Clothes were typically washed in cold water, often in rivers or tubs, using harsh lye soap.
The methodical scrubbing and beating of clothes on washboards were physically demanding and repetitive actions. Clothes were then consistently hung out to dry, often in the open air, a visible sign of domestic work. Due to the effort involved, laundry was often done weekly or bi-weekly, leading to the consistent re-wearing of garments between washes. Odors were a consistent aspect of daily life. The lack of frequent bathing, combined with manual labor, limited access to clean clothes, and the presence of animals, meant that body odor was a consistently accepted part of the environment. Personal fragrances or deodorants as known today were not in widespread use. The consistent smells of sweat, dust, horses, and wood smoke permeated daily life. The disposal of waste was also handled with consistent, albeit often rudimentary methods. Outhouses were a consistent feature of most homes and businesses. Wastewater might be consistently thrown into the street or into designated disposal areas. This systematic but unsanitary waste management contributed to various health issues, a predictable consequence of the prevailing conditions. These hygiene habits, while appearing uncommon from a modern perspective, were consistent adaptations to the specific environmental and technological constraints of the Old West. They represented a methodical approach to maintaining personal cleanliness and health within the available means. The rapid growth and often singular economic drivers of the Old West consistently led to the rise and fall of settlements, resulting in the phenomenon of ghost towns. These were places that, having flourished for a period, systematically declined and were eventually abandoned, leaving behind silent remnants of their past. The primary cause for the consistent abandonment of these towns was the exhaustion of natural resources, particularly mineral deposits. A mining town would consistently boom with the discovery of gold or silver. Miners and businesses would flock to the location, leading to the rapid construction of buildings, stores, and saloons.
The consistent promise of wealth fueled this initial surge in population and infrastructure. The sounds of mining activity and commerce would fill the air. However, once the vein of ore was depleted or proved consistently unprofitable to extract, the economic reason for the town's existence would systematically vanish. Mines would close, jobs would disappear, and the flow of money would cease. This consistent decline in economic viability would trigger a predictable exodus of the population. One by one, businesses would close, and residents would pack their belongings and move to other areas with new opportunities. The systematic packing of wagons and the consistent departure of individuals marked the beginning of a town's decline. Other causes for abandonment included the bypassing of a town by new transportation routes, particularly railroads. A town that once thrived as a stagecoach stop or a river port might consistently see its commerce dry up if a new railway line was built through a different location.
The consistent rerouting of goods and passengers would leave the bypassed town economically isolated, leading to a gradual but systematic abandonment. The sound of train whistles, once a symbol of progress, would consistently be absent. Natural disasters also contributed to the consistent abandonment of settlements. Prolonged droughts could consistently deplete water sources, making agriculture or ranching unsustainable. Floods could consistently destroy buildings and infrastructure. These environmental events, when severe enough, could systematically force residents to leave as the cost of rebuilding or enduring the conditions became too high. The consistent failure of crops or the consistent depletion of water tables were clear signals for departure. The process of a town becoming a ghost town was typically a slow and consistent one rather than a sudden, dramatic event. Buildings would remain empty, windows might break, and paint would peel. The sounds of human activity would consistently diminish, replaced by the persistent whispers of the wind through empty structures and the subtle sounds of nature reclaiming the land. The consistent accumulation of dust and the gradual decay of buildings were visual indicators of abandonment. These ghost towns, with their silent streets and crumbling structures, served as consistent reminders of the transient nature of opportunity in the Old West. They became physical monuments to the consistent cycles of boom and bust that defined the frontier economy. The unchanging presence of abandoned buildings standing under the consistent western sky offered a unique insight into the impermanence of human settlements when their primary economic purpose ceased to exist. Their very silence speaks volumes about the systematic forces that shaped their rise and fall. As our extensive exploration of life in the Old West concludes, we can now reflect on the pervasive theme of consistency that wove through its diverse elements. From the most dramatic gunfights to the quietest moments of daily routine, a methodical rhythm underscored existence in this transformative period.
We systematically examined the predictable dynamics that characterized individuals known for their firearm proficiency, observing their consistent practices and the common outcomes of their confrontations. The intricate social structures of frontier towns, including the consistent patterns of personal lives and the structured presence of establishments like saloons and brothels, revealed how communities adapted to transient populations. The unwavering dedication of tough sheriffs, consistently enforcing laws and performing administrative duties, laid the groundwork for predictable civic order. Our journey then traversed the consistent threats posed by outlaws through their methodical misdeeds, like bank and stagecoach robberies, which in turn spurred the consistent development of law enforcement and community responses. We delved into the steady creation of myths and legends, narratives that consistently provided meaning and explanation for the often challenging and unpredictable realities of the frontier. The ritualized nature of duels, with their consistent rules and predictable mechanics, offered a glimpse into personal codes of conduct. We then immersed ourselves in the consistent rhythms of daily life, the repetitive tasks of cowboys managing herds, the methodical construction and architecture of frontier towns,
and the consistent operation of steam-powered railroads that transformed landscapes and trade. The meticulous work of gold and silver miners, with their consistent routines of extraction and processing, defined economic pursuits. We observed the regularity of wagon and stagecoach travel, a predictable journey across vast distances. Finally, we explored the consistent reliance on everyday tools and equipment, from axes to cast-iron cookware, each used in predictable routines essential for survival and daily tasks. The diverse methods of communication, from mail riders to the telegraph, revealed consistent efforts to connect dispersed communities. And the consistent flora and fauna of the Western landscape provided the unchanging backdrop against which all these human activities unfolded.
What emerges from this comprehensive examination is not a chaotic tableau, but a tapestry woven with threads of unwavering regularity. The Old West, despite its popular image of wild unpredictability, was fundamentally shaped by consistent effort, methodical adaptation, and a continuous search for order amidst expansion. The human drive to establish routines, to develop predictable systems for work, travel, and social interaction was the enduring force. This deep dive into the methodical details of frontier life, from the precise mechanics of a gunfight to the consistent clatter of a printing press, serves to illustrate how even seemingly tumultuous periods are underpinned by fundamental patterns. It is this pervasive consistency, this quiet adherence to routine and observable fact, that allowed communities to take root and flourish. Thank you for joining us tonight on Board a Bed. We truly appreciate you choosing to spend your valuable time with our detailed explorations. We hope this comprehensive journey through the consistent realities and routines of the Old West has provided the perfectly structured backdrop for your transition to sleep. Remember, for more wonderfully systematic stories designed to lull you into deep slumber, be sure to subscribe to Bore to Bed. Sweet dreams, and may your mind find calm.